Men Without Women by Ernest Hemingway. The Undefeated. Manuel Garcia climbed the stairs to Don Miguel Retana's office. He set down his suitcase and knocked on the door. There was no answer. Manuel, standing in the hallway, felt there was someone in the room. He felt it through the door. "Retana," he said, listening. There was no answer. He's there all right, Manuel thought. "Retana," he said, and banged the door. "Who's there?" said someone in the office. "Me, Manolo," Manuel said. "What do you want?" asked the voice. "I want to work," Manuel said. Something in the door clicked several times, and it swung open. Manuel went in, carrying a suitcase. A little man sat behind a desk at the far end of the room. Over his head was a bull's head, stuffed by a Madrid taxidermist. On the walls were framed photographs and bullfight posters. The little man sat looking at Manuel. "I thought they'd killed you," he said. Manuel knocked with his knuckles on the desk. The little man sat looking at him across the desk. "How many corridas you had this year?" Retana asked. "One," he answered. "Just that one?" the little man asked. "That's all." "I read about it in the papers," Retana said. He leaned back in the chair and looked at Manuel. Manuel looked up at the stuffed bull. He had seen it often before. He felt a certain family interest in it. It had killed his brother, the promising one, about 9 years ago. Manuel remembered the day. There was a brass plate on the oak shield the bull's head was mounted on. Manuel could not read it, but he imagined it was in memory of his brother. Well, he had been a good kid. The plate said, "The bull Mariposa of the Duke of Veragua, which accepted 9 varas for 7 caballos, and caused the death of Antonio Garcia Novillero, April 27, 1909. Retana saw him looking at the stuffed bull's head. "The lot the Duke sent me for Sunday will make a scandal," he said. "They're all bad in the legs." "What do they say about them at the cafe?" "I don't know," Manuel said. "I just got in." "Yes," said Retana. "You still have your bag." He looked at Manuel, leaning back behind the big desk. "Sit down," he said. "Take off your cap." Manuel sat down. His cap off, his face was changed. He looked pale, and his coleta, pinned forward on his head so that it would not show under the cap, gave him a strange look. "You don't look well," Retana said. "I just got out of the hospital," Manuel said. "I heard they'd cut your leg off," Retana said. "No," said Manuel. "It got all right." Retana leaned forward across the desk and pushed a wooden box of cigarettes toward Manuel. "Have a cigarette," he said. "Thanks." Manuel lit it. "Smoke?" he said, offering the match to Retana. "No," Retana waved his hand. "I never smoke." Retana watched him smoking. "Why don't you go and get a job and go to work?" he said. "I don't want to work," said Manuel. "I'm a bullfighter." "There aren't any bullfighters anymore," Retana said. "I'm a bullfighter," Manuel said. "Yes, while you're in there," Retana said. Manuel laughed. Retana sat, saying nothing and looking at Manuel. "I'll put you in a nocturnal if you want," Retana offered. "When?" Manuel asked. "Tomorrow night." "I don't like to substitute for anybody," Manuel said. "That was the way they all got killed. That was the way Salvador got killed." He tapped with his knuckles on the table. "That's all I've got," Retana said. "Why don't you put me on next week?" Manuel suggested. "You wouldn't draw," Retana said. "All they want is Litri and Rubito and La Torre. Those kids are good." They'd come to see me get it, Manuel said, hopefully. No, they wouldn't. They don't know who you are anymore. I've got a lot of stuff, Manuel said. I'm offering to put you on tomorrow night, Rotana said. You can work with young Hernandez and kill 2 novillos after the chariots. Who's novillos? Manuel asked. I don't know, whatever stuff they've got in the corrals. What the veterinarians won't pass in the daytime. I don't like to substitute, Manuel said. You can take it or leave it, Rotana said. He leaned forward over the papers. He was no longer interested. The appeal that Manuel had made to him for a moment when he thought of the old days was gone. He would like to get him to substitute for Larita because he could get him cheaply. He could get others cheaply, too. He would like to help him, though. Still, he had given him the chance. It was up to him. How much do I get? Manuel asked. He was still playing with the idea of refusing, but he knew he could not refuse. 250 pesetas, Rotana said. He had thought of 500, but when he opened his mouth, it said 250. You pay Villalta 7,000, Manuel said. You're not Villalta, Rotana said. I know it, Manuel said. He draws it, Manolo, Rotana said in explanation. Sure, said Manuel. He stood up. Give me the 300, Rotana. All right, Rotana agreed. He reached in the drawer for a paper. Can I have 50 now? Manuel asked. Sure, said Rotana. He took a 50 peseta note out of his pocketbook and laid it, spread out flat, on the table. Manuel picked it up and put it in his pocket. What about a cuadrilla? He asked. There's the boys that always work for me nights, Rotana said. They're all right. Well, how about picadors? Manuel asked. They're not much, Rotana admitted. I've got to have one good peak, Manuel said. We'll get him then, Rotana said. Go and get him. Not out of this, Manuel said. I'm not paying for any cuadrillo out of 60 druros. Rotana said nothing but looked at Manuel across the big desk. You know I've got to have one good pick, Manuel said. Rotana said nothing but looked at Manuel from a long way off. It isn't right, Manuel said. Rotana was still considering him, leaning back in his chair, considering him from a long way away. They're the regular picks, he offered. I know, Manuel said. I know your regular picks. Rotana did not smile. Manuel knew it was over. All I want is an even break, Manuel said reasoningly. When I go out there, I want to be able to call my shots on the bull. It only takes one good picador. He was talking to a man who was no longer listening. If you want something extra, Rotana said, go and get it. There will be a regular cuadrilla out there. Bring as many of your own picks as you want. The charlatava is over by 10:30. All right, Manuel said, if that's the way you feel about it. That's the way, Rotana said. I'll see you tomorrow night, Manuel said. I'll be out there, Rotana said. Manuel picked up his suitcase and went out. Shut the door, Rotana called. Manuel looked back. Rotana was sitting forward looking at some papers. Manuel pulled the door tight until it clicked. He went down the stairs and out of the door into the hot brightness of the street. It was very hot in the street, and the light on the white buildings was sudden and hard on his eyes. He walked down the shady side of the steep street toward Puerta del Sol. The shade felt solid and cool as running water. The heat came suddenly as he crossed the intersecting streets. Manuel saw no one he knew in all the people he passed. Just before the Puerta del Sol, he turned into a cafe. It was quiet in the cafe. There were a few men sitting at tables against the wall. At one table, 4 men played cards. Most of the men sat against the wall smoking, empty coffee cups and liqueur glasses before them on the tables. Manuel went through the long room to a small room in back. A man sat at a table in the corner asleep. Manuel sat down at one of the tables. A waiter came in and stood beside Manuel's table. "Have you seen Zorito?" Manuel asked him. "He was in before lunch," the waiter answered. "He won't be back before 5 o'clock." "Bring me some coffee and milk and a shot of the ordinary," Manuel said. The waiter came back into the room carrying a tray with a big coffee glass and a liqueur glass on it. In his left hand he held a bottle of brandy. He swung these down to the table, and a boy who had followed him poured coffee and milk into the glass from two shiny, spouted pots with long handles. Manuel took off his cap, and the waiter noticed his pigtail pinned forward on his head. He winked at the coffee boy as he poured out the brandy into the little glass beside Manuel's coffee. The coffee boy looked at Manuel's pale face curiously. "You fighting here?" asked the waiter, corking up the bottle. "Yes," Manuel said, "tomorrow." The waiter stood there, holding the bottle on one hip. "You in the Charlie Chaplin's?" he asked. The coffee boy looked away, embarrassed. "No, in the ordinary." "I thought they were going to have Chavez and Hernandez," the waiter said. "No, me and another." "Who, Chavez or Hernandez?" "Hernandez, I think." "What's the matter with Chavez? He got hurt." "Where did you hear that? Ratana?" "Hey, Louis," the waiter called to the next room. "Chavez got cogida." Manuel had taken the wrapper off the lumps of sugar and dropped them into his coffee. He stirred it and drank it down, sweet, hot, and warming in his empty stomach. He drank off the brandy. "Give me another shot of that," he said to the waiter. The waiter uncorked the bottle and poured the glass full, slopping another drink into the saucer. Another waiter had come up in front of the table. The coffee boy was gone. "Is Chavez hurt bad?" the second waiter asked Manuel. "I don't know," Manuel said. "Bertana didn't say." "A hell of a lot he cares," the tall waiter said. Manuel had not seen him before. He must have just come up. "If you stand in with Ratana in this town, you're a made man," the tall waiter said. "If you aren't in with him, you might as well just go out and shoot yourself." "You said it," the other waiter who had come in said. "You said it then." "You're right, I said it. I know what I'm talking about when I talk about that bird." "Look what he's done for Villalta," the first waiter said. "And that ain't all," the tall waiter said. "Look what he's done for Marcial Lalanda. Look what he's done for Nacional." "You said it, kid," agreed the short waiter. Manuel looked at them, standing talking in front of his table. He had drunk his second brandy. They had forgotten about him. They were not interested in him. "Look at that bunch of camels," the tall waiter said. "Did you ever see this Nacional too?" "I saw him last Sunday, didn't I?" "He's a giraffe," the short waiter said. "What did I tell you?" the tall waiter said. "Those are Ratana's boys." "Say, give me another shot of that," Manuel said. He had poured the brandy the waiter had slopped over in the saucer into his glass and drank it while they were talking. The original waiter poured his glass full mechanically, and the three of them went out of the room talking. In the far corner the man was still asleep, snoring slightly on the intaking breath, his head back against the wall. Manuel drank his brandy. He felt sleepy himself. It was too hot to go out into the town. Besides, there was nothing to do. He wanted to see Zorito. He would go to sleep while he waited. He kicked his suitcase under the table to be sure it was there. Perhaps it would be better to put it back under the seat, against the wall. He leaned down and shoved it under. Then he leaned forward on the table and went to sleep. When he woke, there was someone sitting across the table from him. He was a big man with a heavy brown face, like an Indian. He had been sitting there some time. He had waved the waiter away and sat reading the paper and occasionally looking down at Manuel, asleep, his head on the table. He read the paper laboriously, forming the words with his lips as he read. When it tired him, he looked at Manuel. He sat heavily in the chair, his black Cordoba hat tipped forward. Manuel sat up and looked at him. "Hello, Zorito," he said. "Hello, kid," the big man said. "I've been asleep." Manuel rubbed his forehead with the back of his fist. "I thought maybe you were." "How's everything?" "Good. How's everything with you?" "Not so good." They were both silent. Zorito, the picador, looked at Manuel's white face. Manuel looked down at the picador's enormous hands folding the paper to put away in his pocket. "I got a favor to ask you, Manos," Manuel said. Manos Duros was Zorito's nickname. He never heard it without thinking of his huge hands. He put them forward on the table self-consciously. "Let's have a drink," he said. "Sure," said Manuel. The waiter came and went and came again. He went out of the room looking back at the two men at the table. "What's the matter, Manolo?" Zorito set down his glass. "Would you peek 2 bowls for me tomorrow night?" Manuel asked, looking up at Zorito across the table. "No," said Zorito, "I'm not peeking." Manuel looked down at his glass. He had expected that answer. Now he had it. Well, he had it. "I'm sorry, Manolo, but I'm not peeking." Zorito looked at his hands. "That's all right," Manuel said. "I'm too old," Zorito said. "I just asked you," Manuel said. "Is it the nocturnal tomorrow?" "That's it. I figured if I had just one good pick, I could get away with it." "How much are you getting?" 300 pesetas. I get more than that for peeking." "I know," said Manuel. "I didn't have any right to ask you." "What do you keep on doing it for?" Zorito asked. "Why don't you cut off your coleta, Manolo?" "I don't know," Manuel said. "You're pretty near as old as I am," Zorito said. "I don't know," Manuel said. "I got to do it. If I can fix it so that I can get an even break, that's all I want. I got to stick with it, Manos." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do. I've tried keeping away from it." "I know how you feel, but it isn't right. You ought to get out and stay out." "I can't do it. Besides, I've been going good lately." Zorito looked at his face. "You've been in the hospital." "But I was going great when I got hurt." Zorito said nothing. He tipped the cognac out of his saucer into his glass. "The paper said they never saw a better faena," Manuel said. Zorito looked at him. "You know when I get going, I'm good," Manuel said. "You're too old," the picador said. "No," said Manuel, "you're 10 years older than I am." "With me it's different." "I'm not too old," Manuel said. They sat silent, Manuel watching the picador's face. "I was going great till I got hurt," Manuel offered. "You ought to have seen me, Manos," Manuel said reproachfully. "I don't want to see you," Zorito said. "It makes me nervous." "You haven't seen me lately." "I've seen you plenty." Zorito looked at Manuel, avoiding his eyes. "You ought to quit it, Manolo." "I can't," Manuel said. "I'm going good now, I tell you." Zorito leaned forward, his hands on the table. "Listen, I'll peek for you, and if you don't go big tomorrow night, you'll quit. See? Will you do that?" "Sure." Zorito leaned back, relieved. "You got to quit," he said. "No monkey business. You got to cut the coleta." "I won't have to quit," Manuel said. "You watch me. I've got the stuff." Zorito stood up. He felt tired from arguing. "You got to quit," he said. "I'll cut your coleta myself." "No, you won't," Manuel said. "You won't have a chance." Zorito called the waiter. "Come on," said Zorito. "Come on up to the house." Manuel reached under the seat for his suitcase. He was happy. He knew Zurita would pick for him. He was the best picador living. It was all simple now. "Come on up to the house, and we'll eat," Zurita said. Manuel stood in the Patio de Caballos, waiting for the Charlie Chaplins to be over. Zurita stood beside him. Where they stood, it was dark. The high door that led into the bullring was shut. Above them, they heard a shout, then another shout of laughter. Then there was silence. Manuel liked the smell of the stables about the Patio de Caballos. It smelt good in the dark. There was another roar from the arena, and then applause, prolonged applause, going on and on. "You ever seen these fellows?" Zurita asked, big and looming beside Manuel in the dark. "No," Manuel said. "They're pretty funny," Zurita said. He smiled to himself in the dark. The high, double, tight-fitting door into the bullring swung open, and Manuel saw the ring and the hard light of the arc lights. The plaza, dark all the way around, rising high. Around the edge of the ring were running and bowing 2 men dressed like tramps, followed by a third in the uniform of a hotel bellboy, who stooped and picked up the hats and canes thrown down into the sand and tossed them back up into the darkness. The electric light went on in the patio. "I'll climb onto one of those ponies while you collect the kids," Zurita said. Behind them came the jingle of the mules, coming out to go into the arena and be hitched onto the dead bull. The members of the quadrilla, who had been watching the burlesque from the one-way between the barrera and the seats, came walking back and stood in a group talking under the electric light in the patio. A good-looking lad in a silver and orange suit came up to Manuel and smiled. "I'm Hernandez," he said, and put out his hand. Manuel shook it. "They're regular elephants we've got tonight," the big boy said cheerfully. "They're big ones with horns," Manuel agreed. "You drew the worst lot," the boy said. "That's all right," Manuel said. "The bigger they are, the more meat for the poor." "Where'd you get that one?" Hernandez grinned. "Oh, that's an old one," Manuel said. "You line up your quadrilla so I can see what you've got." "You've got some good kids," Hernandez said. He was very cheerful. He had been on twice before in nocturnals and was beginning to get a following in Madrid. He was happy the fight would start in a few minutes. "Where are the peaks?" Manuel asked. "They're back in the corrals fighting about who gets the beautiful horses," Hernandez grinned. The mules came through the gate in a rush, the whips snapping, bells jangling, and the young bull plowing a furrow of sand. They formed up for the paseo as soon as the bull had gone through. Manuel and Hernandez stood in front. The youths of the quadrillas were behind, their heavy capes furled over their arms. In back, the 4 picadors, mounted, holding their steel-tipped push-poles erect in the half-dark of the corral. "It's a wonder Ratana wouldn't give us enough light to see the horses by," one picador said. "Well, he knows we'll be happier if we don't get too good a look at these skins," another peak answered. "This thing I'm barely on keeps me off the ground," the picador said. "Well, they're horses." "Sure, they're horses." They talked, sitting their gaunt horses in the dark. Zurita said nothing. He had the only steady horse of the lot. He had tried him, wheeling him in the corrals, and he responded to the bit and the spurs. He had taken the bandage off his right eye and cut the strings where they had tied his ears tight shut at the base. He was a good, solid horse, solid on his legs. That was all he needed. He intended to ride him all through the corrida. He had already, since he had mounted, sitting in the half-dark in the big quilted saddle, waiting for the paseo, peeked through the whole corrida in his mind. The other picadors went on talking on both sides of him. He did not hear them. The 2 matadors stood together in front of their left peons. their capes furled over their left arms in the same fashion. Manuel was thinking about the three lads in back of him. They were all three Madrileños, like Hernandez, boys about 19. One of them, a gypsy, serious, aloof, and dark-faced, he liked the look of. He turned. "What's your name, kid?" he asked the gypsy. "Fuentes," the gypsy said. "That's a good name," Manuel said. The gypsy smiled, showing his teeth. "You take the bull and give him a little run when he comes out," Manuel said. "All right," the gypsy said. His face was serious. He began to think about just what he would do. "There she goes," Manuel said to Hernandez. "All right, we'll go." Heads up, swinging with the music, their right arms swinging free, they stepped out, crossing the sanded arena under the arc lights, the cuadrillas opening out behind, the picadors riding after. Behind came the bull ring servants and the jingling mules. The crowd applauded Hernandez as they marched across the arena. Arrogant, swinging, they looked straight ahead as they marched. They bowed before the president, and the procession broke up into its component parts. The bullfighters went over to the barrera and changed their heavy mantles for the light fighting capes. The mules went out. The picadors galloped jerkily around the ring, and two rode out the gate they had come in by. The servants swept the sand smooth. Manuel drank a glass of water, poured for him by one of Ratana's deputies, who was acting as his manager and sword handler. Hernandez came over from speaking with his own manager. "You got a good hand, kid," Manuel complimented him. "They like me," Hernandez said happily. "How did the paseo go?" Manuel asked, Ratana's man. "Like a wedding," said the handler. "Fine. You came out like Joselito and Belmonte." Cerrito rode by, a bulky equestrian statue. He wheeled his horse and faced him toward the toril on the far side of the ring where the bull would come out. It was strange under the arc light. He peeked in the hot afternoon sun for big money. He did not like this arc light business. He wished they would get started. Manuel went up to him. "Peek him, Manos. Cut him down to size for me." "I'll peek him, kid," Cerrito spat on the sand. "I'll make him jump out of the ring." "Lean on him, Manos," Manuel said. "I'll lean on him," Cerrito said. "What's holding it up?" "He's coming now," Manuel said. Cerrito sat there, his feet in the box stirrups, his great legs in the buckskin-covered armor gripping the horse, the reins in his left hand, the long peak held in his right hand, his broad hat well down over his eyes to shade them from the lights, watching the distant door of the toril. His horse's ears quivered. Cerrito patted him with his left hand. The red door of the toril swung back, and for a moment Cerrito looked into the empty passageway far across the arena. Then the bull came out in a rush, skidding on his four legs as he came out under the light, then charging in a gallop, moving softly in a fast gallop, silent, except as he woofed through wide nostrils as he charged, glad to be free after the dark pen. In the first row of seats, slightly bored, leaning forward to write on the cement wall in front of his knees, the substitute bullfight critic of El Heraldo scribbled, "Compañero Negro 42 came out at 90 miles an hour with plenty of gas." Manuel, leaning against the barrera, watching the bull, waved his hand and the gypsy ran out, trailing his cape. The bull, in full gallop, pivoted and charged the cape, his head down, his tail rising. The gypsy moved in a zigzag, and as he passed, the bull caught sight of him and abandoned the cape to charge the man. The gyp sprinted and vaulted the red fence of the barrera as the bull struck it with his horns. He tossed into it twice with his horns, banging into the wood blindly. The critic of El Heraldo lit a cigarette and tossed the match at the bull, then wrote in his notebook, Large, and with enough horns to satisfy the cash customers, Compañero showed a tendency to cut into the terrain of the bullfighters. Manuel stepped out onto the hard sand as the bull banged into the fence. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Zorito sitting the white horse close to the barrera, about a quarter of the way around the ring to the left. Manuel held the cape close in front of him, a fold in each hand, and shouted at the bull. "Huh! Huh!" The bull turned, seemed to brace against the fence as he charged in a scramble, driving into the cape as Manuel sidestepped, pivoted on his heels with the charge of the bull, and swung the cape just ahead of the horns. At the end of the swing, he was facing the bull again and held the cape in the same position, close in front of his body, and pivot again as the bull recharged. Each time as he swung, the crowd shouted. 4 times he swung with the bull, lifting the cape so that it billowed full, and each time bringing the bull around to charge again. Then at the end of the 5th swing, he held the cape against his hip and pivoted, so the cape swung out like a ballet dancer's skirt and wound the bull around himself like a belt to step clear, leaving the bull facing Zorito on the white horse. Come up and planted firm, the horse facing the bull, its ears forward, its lips nervous, Zorito, his hat over his eyes, leaning forward, the long pole sticking out before and behind in a sharp angle under his right arm, held halfway down, the triangular iron point, facing the bull. El Geraldo's second-string critic, drawing on his cigarette, his eyes on the bull, wrote, "The veteran Manolo designed a series of acceptable Veronicas, ending in a very Belmontistic recorte that earned applause from the regulars, and we entered the tercio of the cavalry." Zorito sat his horse, measuring the distance between the bull and the end of the peak. As he looked, the bull gathered himself together and charged, his eyes on the horse's chest. As he lowered his head to hook, Zorito sunk the point of the peak in the swelling hump of muscle above the bull's shoulder, leaned all his weight on the shaft, and with his left hand pulled the horse into the air, front hooves pawing, and swung him to the right as he pushed the bull under and through, so the horns passed safely under the horse's belly, and the horse came down, quivering, the bull's tail brushing his chest as he charged the cape Hernandez offered him. Hernandez ran sideways, taking the bull out and away with the cape toward the other picador. He fixed with a swing of the cape, squarely facing the horse and rider, and stepped back. As the bull saw the horse he charged, the picador's lance slid along his back, and as the shock of the charge lifted the horse, the picador was already halfway out of the saddle, lifting his right leg clear as he missed with the lance and falling to the left side to keep the horse between him and the bull. The horse, lifted and gored, crashed over with the bull driving into him. The picador gave a shove with his boots against the horse and lay clear, waiting to be lifted and hauled away and put on his feet. Manuel let the bull drive into the fallen horse. He was in no hurry. The picador was safe. Besides, it did a picador like that good to worry. He'd stay on longer next time. Lousy peaks. He looked across the sand at Zorito a little way out from the barrera, his horse rigid, waiting. "Huh," he called to the bull. "Tomar," holding the cape in both hands so that it would catch his eye. The bull detached himself from the horse and charged the cape, and Manuel, running sideways and holding the cape spread wide, stopped, swung on his heels, and brought the bull sharply around facing Zorito. Compañero accepted a pair of varas for the death of one Rosinante, with Hernandez and Manolo at the Keats, El Geraldo's critic wrote. He pressed on the iron, and clearly showed he was no horse lover. The veteran Zorito resurrected some of his old stuff with the pike pole, notably the suerte. "Ole! Ole!" the man sitting behind him shouted. The shout was lost in the roar of the crowd, and he slapped the critic on the back. The critic looked up to see Zorito directly below him, leaning far out over his horse, the length of the peak rising at a sharp angle under his armpit, holding the peak almost by the point, bearing down with all his weight, holding the bull off, the bull pushing and driving to get at the horse, and Zorito far out on top of him, holding him, and slowly pivoting the horse against the pressure, so that at last he was clear. Zorito felt the moment when the horse was clear and the bull could come past, and relaxed the absolute steel lock of his resistance. The triangular steel point of the peak ripped in the bull's hump of shoulder muscle as he tore loose to find Hernandez's cape before his muzzle. He charged blindly into the cape, and the boy took him out into the open arena. Zorito sat patting his horse and looking at the bull charging on the cape that Hernandez swung for him, out under the bright light, while the crowd shouted. "You see that one?" he said to Manuel. "It was a wonder," Manuel said. "I got him that time," Zorito said. "Look at him now." At the conclusion of a closely turned pass of the cape, the bull slid to his knees. He was up at once, but far out from across the sand, Manuel and Zorito saw the shine of the pumping flow of blood, smooth against the black of the bull's shoulder. "I got him that time," Zorito said. "He's a good bull," Manuel said. "If they gave me another shot at him, I'd kill him," Zorito said. "They'll change the thirds on us," Manuel said. "Look at him now," Zorito said. "I got to go over there," Manuel said, and started on a run for the other side of the ring, where the monos were leading a horse out by the bridle toward the bull, whacking him on the legs with rods and all in a procession, trying to get him toward the bull, who stood, dropping his head, pawing, unable to make up his mind to charge. Zorito, sitting his horse, walked toward the scene, not missing any detail, and scowled. Finally, the bull charged. The horse leaders ran for the barrera. The picador hit too far back, and the bull got under the horse, lifted him, and threw him onto his back. Zorito watched. The monos in their red shirts running out to drag the picador clean, the picador now on his feet, swearing and flopping his arms, Manuel and Hernandez standing ready with their capes, and the bull, the great black bull with a horse on his back, hooves dangling, the bridle caught in the horns. Black bull with a horse on his back, staggering, short-legged, then arching his neck and lifting, thrusting, charging to slide the horse off, horse sliding down. Then the bull into a lunging charge at the cape Manuel spread for him. The bull was slower now, Manuel felt. He was bleeding badly. There was a sheen of blood all down his flank. Manuel offered him the cape again. There he came, eyes open, ugly, watching the cape. Manuel stepped to the side and raised his arms, tightening the cape ahead for the bull for the Veronica. Now he was facing the bull. Yes, his head was going down a little. He was carrying it lower. That was Zorito. Manuel flopped the cape. There he comes. He sidestepped and swung in another Veronica. He's shooting awfully accurately, he thought. He's had enough fight, so he's watching now. He's hunting now. Got his eye on me. But I always give him the cape. He shook the cape at the bull. There he comes. He sidestepped. Awful close that time. I don't want to work that close to him. The edge of the cape was wet with blood where it had swept along the bull's back as he went by. All right, here's the last one. Manuel, facing the bull, having turned him with each charge, offered the cape with his two hands. The bull looked at him, eyes watching, horns straight forward. The bull looked at him, watching. "Huh," Manuel said. "Toro," and leaning back, swung the cape forward. Here he comes. He sidestepped, swung the cape in back of him, and pivoted so the bull followed a swirl of cape and then was left with nothing, fixed by the pass, dominated by the cape. Manuel swung the cape under his muzzle with one hand to show the bull was fixed and walked away. There was no applause. Manuel walked across the sand toward the barrera while Zorito rode out of the ring. The trumpet had blown to change the act to the planting of the banderillos, while Manuel had been working with the bull. He had not consciously noticed it. The monos were spreading canvas over the two dead horses and sprinkling sawdust around them. Manuel came up to the barrera for a drink of water. Ratana's man handed him the heavy, porous jug. Fuentes, the tall gypsy, was standing holding a pair of banderillos, holding them together. Slim red sticks, fishhooks, points out. He looked at Manuel. "Go on out there," Manuel said. The gypsy trotted out. Manuel set down the jug and watched. He wiped his face with the handkerchief. The critic of El Heraldo reached for the bottle of warm champagne that stood between his feet, took a drink, and finished his paragraph. The aged Manolo rated no applause for a vulgar series of lances with the cape, and we entered the third of the palings. Alone in the center of the ring, the bull stood, still fixed. Fuentes, tall, flat-backed, walking toward him arrogantly, his arms spread out, the two slim red sticks, one in each hand, held by the fingers, pointed straight forward. Fuentes walked there forward. Back of him and to one side was a peon with a cape. The bull looked at him and was no longer fixed. His eyes watched Fuentes, now standing still. Now he leaned back, calling to him. Fuentes twitched the two banderillos, and the light on the steel points caught the bull's eye. His tail went up, and he charged. He came straight, his eyes on the man. Fuentes stood still, leaning back, the banderillos pointing forward. As the bull lowered his head to hook, Fuentes leaned backward. His arms came together and rose, his two hands touching, the banderillos descending two red lines, and leaning forward, drove the points into the bull's shoulder. Leaning far in over the bull's horns and pivoting on the two upright sticks, his legs tight together, his body curving to one side to let the bull pass. "Olé!" from the crowd. The bull was hooking wildly, jumping like a trout, all 4 feet off the ground. The red shaft of the banderillos tossed as he jumped. Manuel, standing at the barrera, noticed that he hooked always to the right. "Tell him to drop the next pair on the right," he said to the kid who started to run out to Fuentes with the new banderillos. A heavy hand fell on his shoulder. It was Zorito. "How do you feel, kid?" he asked. Manuel was watching the bull. Zorito leaned forward on the barrera, leaning the weight of his body on his arms. Manuel turned to him. "You're looking good," Zorito said. Manuel shook his head. He had nothing to do now until the next third. The gypsy was very good with the banderillos. The bull would come to him in the next third in good shape. He was a good bull. It had all been easy up to now. The final stuff with the sword was all he worried over. He did not really worry. He did not even think about it. But standing there, he had a heavy sense of apprehension. He looked out at the bull, planning his faena, his work with the red cloth that was to reduce the bull, to make him manageable. The gypsy was walking out toward the bull again, walking heel and toe, insultingly, like a ballroom dancer, the red shafts of the banderillos twitching with his walk. The bull watched him, not fixed now, hunting him, but waiting to get close enough so that he could be sure of getting him, getting the horns into him. As Fuentes walked forward, the bull charged. Fuentes ran across the quarter of a circle as the bull charged, and as he passed running backward, stopped, swung forward, rose on his toes, arms straight out, and sunk the banderillos straight down into the tight of the big shoulder muscles as the bulls missed him. The crowd were wild about it. "That kid won't stay in this night stuff long," Ratana's man said to Zorito. "He's good," Zorito said. "Watch him now." They watched. Fuentes was standing with his back against the barrera. Two of the quadrilla were back of him, with their capes ready to flop over the fence to distract the bull. The bull, with his tongue cut out, his barrel heaving, was watching the gypsy. He thought he had him now, back against the red planks, only a short charge away. The bull watched him. The gypsy bent back, drew back his arms, the banderillas pointing toward the bull. He called to the bull, stamped one foot. The bull was suspicious. He wanted the man, no more barbs in the shoulder. Fuentes walked a little closer to the bull, bent back, called again. Somebody in the crowd shouted a warning. "He's too damn close," Cerrito said. "Watch him," Ratana's man said. Leaning back, inciting the bull with the banderillas, Fuentes jumped, both feet off the ground. As he jumped, the bull's tail rose and he charged. Fuentes came down on his toes, arms straight out, whole body arching forward, and drove the shafts straight down as he swung his body clear of the right horn. The bull crashed into the barrera, where the flopping capes had attracted his eye as he lost the man. The gypsy came running along the barrera toward Manuel, taking the applause of the crowd. His vest was ripped, where he had not quite cleared the point of the horn. He was happy about it, showing it to the spectators. He made the tour of the ring. Cerrito saw him go by, smiling, pointing at his vest. He smiled. Somebody else was planting the last pair of banderillas. Nobody was paying any attention. Ratana's man tucked a baton inside the red cloth of a muleta, folded the cloth over it, and handed it over the barrera to Manuel. He reached in the leather sword case, took out a sword, and holding it by its leather scabbard, reached it over the fence to Manuel. Manuel pulled the blade out by the red hilt, and the scabbard fell limp. He looked at Cerrito. The big man saw he was sweating. "Now you get him, kid," Cerrito said. Manuel nodded. "He's in good shape," Cerrito said. "Just like you want him," Ratana's man assured him. Manuel nodded. The trumpeter, up under the roof, blew for the final act, and Manuel walked across the arena toward where, up in the dark boxes, the president must be. In the front row of seats, the substitute bullfight critic of El Heraldo took a long drink of the warm champagne. He had decided it was not worthwhile to write a running story and would write up the corrida back in the office. What the hell was it, anyway? Only a nocturnal. If he missed anything, he would get it out of the morning papers. He took another drink of the champagne. He had a date at Maxime's at 12. Who were these bullfighters, anyway? Kids and bums. A bunch of bums. He put his pad of paper in his pocket and looked over toward Manuel, standing very much alone in the ring, gesturing with his hat in a salute toward a box he could not see high up in the dark plaza. Out in the ring, the bull stood quiet, looking at nothing. "I dedicate this bull to you, Mr. President, and to the public of Madrid, the most intelligent and generous of the world," was what Manuel was saying. It was a formula. He had said it all. It was a little long for nocturnal use. He bowed at the dark, straightened, tossed his hat over his shoulder, and carrying the muleta in his left hand and the sword in his right, walked out toward the bull. Manuel walked toward the bull. The bull looked at him. His eyes were quick. Manuel noticed the banderillas hung down on his left shoulder and the steady sheen of blood from Cerrito's peeking. He noticed the way the bull's feet were. As he walked forward, holding the muleta in his left hand and the sword in his right, he watched the bull's feet. The bull could not charge without gathering his feet together. Now he stood square on them, dully. Manuel walked toward him, watching his feet. This was all right. He could do this. He must work to get the bull's head down so they could go in past the horns and kill him. He did not think about the sword, not about killing the bull. He thought about one thing at a time. The coming things oppressed him, though. Walking forward, watching the bull's feet, he saw successively his eyes his wet muzzle, and the wide, forward-pointing spread of his horns. The bull had light circles about his eyes. His eyes watched Manuel. He felt he was going to get this little one with the white face. Standing still now and spreading the red cloth of the muleta with the sword, pricking the point into the cloth so that the sword, now held in his left hand, spread the red flannel like the jib of a boat. Manuel noticed the points of the bull's horns. One of them was splintered from banging against the barrera. The other was as sharp as a porcupine quill. Manuel noticed while spreading the muleta that the white base of the horn was stained red. While he noticed these things, he did not lose sight of the bull's feet. The bull watched Manuel steadily. He's on the defensive now, Manuel thought. He's reserving himself. I've got to bring him out of that. Get his head down. Always get his head down. Cerrito had had his head down once, but he's come back. He'll bleed when I start him going, and that will bring it down. Holding the muleta with the sword in his left hand wide-legged in front of him, he called to the bull. The bull looked at him. He leaned back insultingly and shook the widespread flannel. The bull saw the muleta. It was a bright scarlet under the arc light. The bull's legs tightened. Here he comes. Whoosh! Manuel turned as the bull came and raised the muleta so that it passed over the bull's horns and swept down his broad back from head to tail. The bull had gone clean up in the air with the charge. Manuel had not moved. At the end of the pass, the bull turned like a cat coming around a corner and faced Manuel. He was on the offensive again. His heaviness was gone. Manuel noted the fresh blood shining down the black shoulder and dripping down the bull's leg. He drew the sword out of the muleta and held it in his right hand. The muleta held low down in his left hand, leaning toward the left. He called to the bull. The bull's legs tightened, his eyes on the muleta. Here he comes, Manuel thought. Yah! He swung with the charge, sweeping the muleta ahead of the bull, his feet firm, the sword following the curve, a point of light under the arcs. The bull recharged as the passe natural finished, and Manuel raised the muleta for a passe de Pedro. Firmly planted, the bull came by his chest under the raised muleta. Manuel lifted his head back to avoid the clattering banderillo shafts. The hot, black bull body touched his chest as it passed. Too damn close, Manuel thought. Cerrito, leaning on the barrera, spoke rapidly to the gypsy, who trotted out toward Manuel with a cape. Cerrito pulled down his hat and looked out across the arena at Manuel. Manuel was facing the bull again, the muleta held low and to the left. The bull's head was down as he watched the muleta. If it was Belmonte doing that stuff, they'd go crazy, Ritana's man said. Cerrito said nothing. He was watching Manuel out in the center of the arena. Where did the boss dig this fellow up? Ritana's man asked. Out of the hospital, Cerrito said. That's where he's going, damn quick, Ritana's man said. Cerrito turned on him. Knock on that, he said, pointing to the barrera. I was just kidding, man, Ritana's man said. Knock on the wood. Ritana's man leaned forward and knocked 3 times on the barrera. Watch the faena, Cerrito said. Out in the center of the ring, under the lights, Manuel was kneeling, facing the bull, and as he raised the muleta in both hands, the bull charged, tail up. Manuel swung his body clear, and as the bull recharged, brought around the muleta in a half circle that pulled the bull to his knees. Why, that's one great bullfighter, Ritana's man said. No, he's not, said Cerrito. Manuel stood up, and the muleta in his left hand, the sword in his right, acknowledged the applause from the dark plaza. The bull had humped himself up from his knees and stood waiting, his head low. Cerrito spoke to 2 of the other lads of the quadrilla, and they ran out to stand back of Manuel with their capes. There were 4 men back of him now. Hernandez had followed him since he first came out with the muleta. Fuentes stood watching, his cape held against his body, tall, in repose, watching lazy-eyed. Now the 2 came up. Hernandez motioned them to stand, one at each side. Manuel stood alone, facing the bull. Manuel waved back the men with the capes. Stepping back cautiously, they saw his face was white and sweating. Didn't they know enough to keep back? Did they want to catch the bull's eye with the capes after he was fixed and ready? He had had enough to worry about without that kind of thing. The bull was standing, his 4 feet square, looking at the muleta. Manuel furled the muleta in his left hand. The bull's eyes watched it. His body was heavy on his feet. He carried his head low, but not too low. Manuel lifted the muleta at him. The bull did not move. Only his eyes watched. He's all lead, Manuel thought. He's all square. He's framed right. He'll take it. He thought in bullfight terms. Sometimes he had a thought and the particular piece of slang would not come into his mind and he could not realize the thought. His instincts and his knowledge worked automatically and his brain worked slowly and in words. He knew all about bulls. He did not have to think about them. He just did the right thing. His eyes noted things and his body performed the necessary measures without thought. If he thought about it, he would be gone. Now, facing the bull, he was conscious of many things at the same time. There were the horns, the one splintered, the other one smoothly sharp, the need to profile himself toward the left horn, lance himself short and straight, lower the muleta so the bull would follow it, and, going in over the horns, put the sword all the way into a little spot about as big as a 5 peseta piece, straight into the back of the neck, between the sharp pitch of the bull's shoulders. He must do all this and must then come out from between the horns. He was conscious he must do all this, but his only thought was in words. Corto y derecho. Corto y derecho, he thought, furling the muleta. Short and straight. Corto y derecho. He drew the sword out of the muleta, profiled on the splintered left horn, dropped the muleta across his body, so his right hand with the sword on the level with his eye made the sign of the cross, and rising on his toes, sighted along the dipping blade of the shoulder at the spot high up between the bull's shoulders. Corto y derecho, he lanced himself on the bull. There was a shock, and he felt himself go up in the air. He pushed on the sword as he went up and over, and it flew out of his hand. He hit the ground, and the bull was on him. Manuel, lying on the ground, kicked the bull's muzzle with his slippered feet, kicking, the bull after him, missing him as an excitement, bumping him with his head, driving the horns into the sand, kicking like a man keeping a ball in the air. Manuel kept the bull from getting a clean thrust at him. Manuel felt the wind on his back from the capes flopping at the bull, and then the bull was gone over him in a rush, dark as his belly went over, not even stepped on. Manuel stood up and picked up the muleta. Fuentes handed him the sword. It was bent where it had struck the shoulder blade. Manuel straightened it on his knee and ran toward the bull, standing now beside one of the dead horses. As he ran, his jacket flopped where it had been ripped under his armpit. "Get him out of here," Manuel shouted to the gypsy. The bull had smelled the blood of the dead horse and ripped into the canvas cover with his horns. He charged Fuentes' cape with the canvas hanging from his splintered horn, and the crowd laughed. Out in the ring, he tossed his head to rid himself of the canvas. Hernandez, running up from behind him, grabbed the end of the canvas and neatly lifted it off the horn. The bull followed in a half charge and stopped still. He was on the defensive again. Manuel was walking toward him with the sword and muleta. Manuel swung the muleta before him. The bull would not charge. Manuel profiled toward the bull, sighting along the dipping blade of the sword. The bull was motionless, seemingly dead on his feet, incapable of another charge. Manuel rose to his toes, sighting along the steel, and charged. Again there was the shock, and he felt himself being borne back in a rush to strike hard on the sand. There was no chance of kicking this time. The bull was on top of him. Manuel lay as though dead, his head on his arms, and the bull bumped him. Bumped his back, bumped his face in the sand. He felt the horn go into the sand between his folded arms. The bull hit him in the small of the back. His face drove into the sand. The horn drove through one of his sleeves, and the bull ripped it off. Manuel was tossed clear, and the bull followed the capes. Manuel got up, found the sword and muleta, tried the point of the sword with his thumb, and then ran toward the barrera for a new sword. Rotana's man headed in the sword over the edge of the barrera. "Wipe your face," he said. Manuel, running again toward the bull, wiped his bloody face with his handkerchief. He had not seen Zorito. Where was Zorito? The quadrilla had stepped away from the bull and waited with their capes. The bull stood, heavy and dull again after the action. Manuel walked toward him with the muleta. He stopped and shook it. The bull did not respond. He passed it right and left and right before the bull's muzzle. The bull's eyes watched it and turned with the swing, but he would not charge. He was waiting for Manuel. Manuel was worried. There was nothing to do but go in, corto y derecho. He profiled close to the bull, crossed the muleto in front of his body, and charged. As he pushed in the sword, he jerked his body to the left to clear the horn. The bull passed him, and the sword shot up in the air, twinkling under the arc lights to fall red-hilted on the sand. Manuel ran over and picked it up. It was bent, and he straightened it over his knee. As he came running toward the bull, fixed again now, he passed Hernandez standing with his cape. "He's all bone," the boy said encouragingly. Manuel nodded, wiping his face. He put the bloody handkerchief in his pocket. There was the bull. He was close to the barrera now. Damn him. Maybe he was all bone. Maybe there was not any place for the sword to go in. The hell there wasn't, he'd show them. He tried to pass with the muleta, and the bull did not move. Manuel chopped the muleta back and forth in front of the bull. Nothing doing. He furled the muleto, drew his sword out, profiled, and drove in on the bull. He felt the sword buckle as he shoved it in, leaning his weight on it, and then it shot high in the air, end over ending into the crowd. Manuel had jerked clear as the sword jumped. The first cushions thrown down from the dark missed him. Then one hit him in the face, his bloody face, looking toward the crowd. They were coming down fast, spotting the sand. Somebody threw an empty champagne bottle from close range. It hit Manuel in the foot. He stood there watching the dark, where the things were coming from. Then something whished through the air and struck by him. Manuel leaned over and picked it up. It was his sword. He straightened it over his knee and gestured with it towards the crowd. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you." Oh, the dirty bastards. Dirty bastards. Oh, the lousy, dirty bastards. He kicked into a cushion as he ran. There was the bull, the same as ever. "All right, you dirty, lousy bastard." Manuel passed the muleto in front of the bull's black muscle. Nothing doing. "You won't. All right." He stepped close and jammed the sharp beak of the muleto into the bull's damp muzzle. The bull was on him as he jumped back, and as he tripped on a cushion, he felt the horn go into him, into his side. He grabbed the horn with his two hands and rode backward, holding tight onto the place. The bull tossed him, and he was clear. He lay still. It was all right. The bull was gone. He got up, coughing and feeling broken and gone. "The dirty bastards." "Give me the sword," he shouted. "Give me the stuff." Fuentes came up with the muleta and the sword. Hernandez put his arm around him. "Go on to the infirmary, man," he said. "Don't be a damn fool." "Get away from me," Manuel said. Get the hell away from me. He twisted free. Hernandez shrugged his shoulders. Manuel ran toward the bull. There was the bull standing, heavy, firmly planted. All right, you bastard. Manuel drew the sword out of the muleta, sighted with the same movement, and flung himself onto the bull. He felt the sword go in all the way, right up to the guard, 4 fingers and his thumb into the bull. The blood was hot on his knuckles, and he was on top of the bull. The bull lurched with him as he lay on and seemed to sink. Then he was standing clear. He looked at the bull going down slowly over his side, then suddenly 4 feet in the air. Then he gestured at the crowd, his hand warm from the bull blood. All right, you bastards. He wanted to say something, but he started to cough. It was hot and choking. He looked down for the muleta. He must go over and salute the president. President, hell. He was sitting down looking at something. It was the bull. His 4 feet up, thick tongue out, things crawling around under his belly and under his legs, crawling where the hair was thin. Dead bull. To hell with the bull. To hell with them all. He started to get to his feet and commenced to cough. He sat down again, coughing. Somebody came and pushed him up. They carried him across the ring to the infirmary, running with him across the sand, standing blocked at the gate as the mules came in. Then around the dark passageway, men grunting as they took him up the stairway, and then laid him down. The doctor and 2 men in white were waiting for him. They laid him out on the table. They were cutting away his shirt. Manuel felt tired. His whole chest felt scalding inside. He started to cough, and they held something to his mouth. Everybody was very busy. There was an electric light in his eyes. He shut his eyes. He heard someone coming very heavily up the stairs. Then he did not hear it. Then he heard a noise far off. That was the crowd. Well, somebody would have to kill his other bull. They had cut away all his shirt. The doctor smiled at him. There was Britanna. Hello, Britanna, Manuel said. He could not hear his voice. Britanna smiled at him and said something. Manuel could not hear it. Zerito stood beside the table, bending over where the doctor was working. He was in his picador clothes, without his hat. Zerito said something to him. Manuel could not hear it. Zerito was speaking to Britanna. One of the men in white smiled and handed Britanna a pair of scissors. Britanna gave them to Zerito. Zerito said something to Manuel. He could not hear it. To hell with this operating table. He'd been on plenty of operating tables before. He was not going to die. There would be a priest if he was going to die. Zerito was saying something to him, holding up the scissors. That was it. They were going to cut off his coleta. They were going to cut off his pigtail. Manuel sat up on the operating table. The doctor stepped back, angry. Someone grabbed him and held him. You couldn't do a thing like that, Manos, he said. He heard suddenly, clearly, Zerito's voice. That's all right, Zerito said. I won't do it. I was joking. I was going good, Manuel said. I didn't have any luck, that was all. Manuel lay back. They had put something over his face. It was all familiar. He inhaled deeply. He felt very tired. He was very, very tired. They took the thing away from his face. I was going good, Manuel said, weakly. I was going great. Ratana looked at Zerito and started for the door. I'll stay here with him, Zerito said. Ratana shrugged his shoulders. Manuel opened his eyes and looked at Zerito. Wasn't I going good, Manos? He asked for confirmation. Sure, said Zerito. You were going great. The doctor's assistants put the cone over Manuel's face, and he inhaled deeply. Zerito stood awkwardly, watching. in another country. In the fall, the war was always there, but we did not go to it anymore. It was cold in the fall in Milan, and the dark came very early. Then the electric lights came on, and it was pleasant along the streets, looking in the windows. There was much game hanging outside the shops, and the snow powdered in the fur of the foxes, and the wind blew their tails. The deer hung stiff and heavy and empty, and small birds blew in the wind, and the wind turned their feathers. It was a cold fall, and the wind came down from the mountains. We were all at the hospital every afternoon, and there were different ways of walking across the town through the dusk to the hospital. 2 of the ways were alongside canals, but they were long. Always, though, you crossed a bridge across a canal to enter the hospital. There was a choice of 3 bridges. On one of them, a woman sold roasted chestnuts. It was warm, standing in front of her charcoal fire, and the chestnuts were warm afterward in your pocket. The hospital was very old and very beautiful, and you entered through a gate and walked across a courtyard and out a gate on the other side. There were funerals usually starting from the courtyard. Beyond the old hospital were the new brick pavilions, and there we met every afternoon, and were all very polite and interested in what was the matter, and sat in the machines that were to make so much difference. The doctor came up to the machine where I was sitting and said, "What do you like best to do before the war? Did you practice a sport?" I said, "Yes, football." "Good," he said. "You will be able to play football again better than ever." My knee did not bend, and the leg dropped straight from the knee to the ankle without a calf, and the machine was to bend the knee and make it move, as in riding a tricycle. But it did not bend yet, and instead the machine lurched when it came to the bending part. The doctor said, "That all will pass. You are a fortunate young man. You will play football again like a champion." In the next machine was a major who had a little hand like a baby's. He winked at me when the doctor examined his hand, which was between 2 leather straps that bounced up and down and flapped the stiff fingers, and said, "And will I too play football, Captain Doctor?" He had been a very great fencer, and before the war, the greatest fencer in Italy. The doctor went to his office in a back room and brought a photograph, which showed a hand that had been withered almost as small as the major's, before it had taken a machine course, and after was a little larger. The major held the photograph with his good hand and looked at it very carefully. "A wound?" he asked. "An industrial accident," the doctor said. "Very interesting, the major said, and handed it back to the doctor. "You have confidence?" "No," said the major. There were 3 boys who came each day who were about the same age as I. They were all 3 from Milan, and one of them was to be a lawyer, and one was to be a painter, and one had intended to be a soldier, and after we were finished with the machines, sometimes we walked back together to the Cafe Cova, which was next door to the Scala. We walked the short way through the communist quarter because we were 4 together. The people hated us because we were officers, and from a wine shop someone would call out, "Abbasso gli ufficiali," as we passed. Another boy who walked with us sometimes and made us 5 wore a silk handkerchief across his face because he had no nose then, and his face was to be rebuilt. He had gone out to the front from the military academy and had been wounded within an hour after he had gone into the front line for the first time. They rebuilt his face, but he came from a very old family and they could never get the nose exactly right. He went to South America and worked in a bank. But this was a long time ago, and then we did not any of us know how it was going to be afterward. We only knew then that there was always the war, but that we were not going to it anymore. We all had the same medals, except the boy with the black silk bandage across his face, and he had not been at the front long enough to get any medals. The tall boy with a very pale face, who was to be a lawyer, had been a lieutenant of Arditi and had 3 medals of the sort we each had only one of. He had lived a very long time with death and was a little detached. We were all a little detached, and there was nothing that held us together except that we met every afternoon at the hospital. Although, as we walked to the cova through the tough part of town, walking in the dark, with light and singing coming out of the wine shops, and sometimes having to walk into the street when the men and women would crowd together on the sidewalk so that we would have had to jostle them to get by, we felt held together by there being something that had happened that they, the people who disliked us, did not understand. We ourselves all understood the cova, where it was rich and warm and not too brightly lighted, and noisy and smoky at certain hours, and there were always girls at the tables and the illustrated papers on a rack on the wall. The girls at the cova were very patriotic, and I found that the most patriotic people in Italy were the cafe girls, and I believe they are still patriotic. The boys at first were very polite about my medals and asked me what I had done to get them. I showed them the papers, which were written in very beautiful language and full of fratellanza and abnegazione, but which really said, with the adjectives removed, that I had been given the medals because I was an American. After that, their manner changed a little toward me, although I was their friend against outsiders. I was a friend, but I was never really one of them after they had read the citations, because it had been different with them and they had done very different things to get their medals. I had been wounded, it was true, but we all knew that being wounded, after all, was really an accident. I was never ashamed of the ribbons, though, and sometimes after the cocktail hour I would imagine myself having done all the things they had done to get their medals. But walking home at night through the empty streets with the cold wind and all the shops closed, trying to keep near the street lights, I knew that I would never have done such things. I was very much afraid to die, and often lay in bed at night by myself, afraid to die and wondering how I would be when I went back to the front again. The 3 with the medals were like hunting hawks, and I was not a hawk, although I might seem a hawk to those who had never hunted. They, the 3, knew better, and so we drifted apart. But I stayed good friends with the boy who had been wounded his first day at the front, because he would never now know how he would have turned out. So he could never be accepted either, and I liked him because I thought perhaps he would not have turned out to be a hawk either. The major, who had been the great fencer, did not believe in bravery, and spent much time while we sat in the machines correcting my grammar. He had complimented me on how I spoke Italian, and we talked together very easily. One day I had said that Italian seemed such an easy language to me that I could not take a great interest in it. Everything was so easy to say. "Ah, yes," the major said. "Why then do you not take up the use of grammar?" So we took up the use of grammar, and soon Italian was such a difficult language that I was afraid to talk to him until I had the grammar straight in my mind. The major came very regularly to the hospital. I do not think he ever missed a day, although I'm sure he did not believe in the machines. There was a time when none of us believed in the machines, and one day the major said it was all nonsense. The machines were new then, and it was we who were to prove them. It was an idiotic idea, he said. A theory, like any other. I had not learned my grammar, and he said I was a stupid, impossible disgrace. And he was a fool to have bothered with me. He was a small man, and he sat up straight in his chair and his right hand thrust into the machine and looked straight ahead at the wall while the straps thumped up and down with his fingers in them. "What will you do when the war is over, if it is over?" he asked me. "Speak grammatically." "I will go to the States." "Are you married?" "No, but I hope to be." "The more of a fool you are," he said. He seemed very angry. "A man must not marry." "Why, Signor Maggiore?" "Don't call me Signor Maggiore." "Why must a man not marry?" "He cannot marry. He cannot marry," he said angrily. "If he is to lose everything, he should not place himself in a position to lose that. He should not place himself in a position to lose. He should find things he cannot lose." He spoke very angrily and bitterly, and looked straight ahead while he talked. "But why should he necessarily lose it?" "He'll lose it," the major said. He was looking at the wall. Then he looked down at the machine and jerked his little hand out from between the straps and slapped it hard against his thigh. "He'll lose it," he almost shouted. "Don't argue with me." Then he called to the attendant who ran the machines. "Come and turn this damn thing off." He went back into the other room for the light treatment and the massage. Then I heard him ask the doctor if he might use his telephone, and he shut the door. When he came back into the room, I was sitting in another machine. He was wearing his cape and had his cap on, and he came directly toward my machine and put his arm on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he said, and patted me on the shoulder with his good hand. "I would not be rude. My wife has just died. You must forgive me." "Oh," I said, feeling sick for him. "I am so sorry." He stood there biting his lower lip. "It is very difficult," he said. "I cannot resign myself." He looked straight past me and out through the window. Then he began to cry. "I'm utterly unable to resign myself," he said, and choked. And then, crying, his head looking up at nothing, carrying himself straight and soldierly, with tears on both his cheeks and biting his lips, he walked past the machines and out the door. The doctor told me that the major's wife, who was very young and whom he had not married until he was definitely invalided out of the war, had died of pneumonia. She had been sick only a few days. No one expected her to die. The major did not come to the hospital for 3 days. Then he came at the usual hour, wearing a black band on the sleeve of his uniform. When he came back, there were large framed photographs around the wall of all sorts of wounds before and after they had been cured by the machines. In front of the machine the major used were 3 photographs of hands like his that were completely restored. I do not know where the doctor got them. I always understood we were the first to use the machines. The photographs did not make much difference to the major, because he only looked out the window. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between 2 lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station there was the warm shadow of the building and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads, hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this juncture for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. "What should we drink?" the girl asked. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. "It's pretty hot," the man said. "Let's drink beer." "Dos cervezas," the man said into the curtain. "Big ones?" a woman asked from the doorway. "Yes, 2 big ones." The woman brought 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. "They look like white elephants," she said. "I've never seen one." The man drank his beer. "No, you wouldn't have." "I might have," the man said. "Just because you say I wouldn't have doesn't prove anything." The girl looked at the bead curtain. "They've painted something on it," she said. "What does it say?" "Anos del Toro. It's a drink." "Could we try it?" The man called, "Listen," through the curtain. The woman came out from the bar. "4 reales. We want 2 Anos del Toro. With water?" "Do you want it with water?" "I don't know," the girl said. "Is it good with water?" "It's all right." "You want them with water?" asked the woman. "Yes, with water." "It tastes like licorice," the girl said, and put the glass down. "That's the way with everything." "Yes," said the girl. "Everything tastes of licorice, especially all the things you've waited so long for, like absinthe." "Oh, cut it out. You started it," the girl said. "I was being amused. I was having a fine time." "Well, let's try and have a fine time." "All right, I was trying. I said the mountains looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright?" "That was bright." "I wanted to try this new drink. That's all we do, isn't it? Look at things and try new drinks?" "I guess so." The girl looked at the hills. "They're lovely hills," she said. "They don't really look like white elephants. I just meant the coloring of their skin through the trees." "Should we have another drink?" "All right." The warm wind blew the bead curtain against the table. "The beer's nice and cool," the man said. "It's lovely," the girl said. "It's really an awfully simple operation, Jig," the man said. "It's not really an operation at all." The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on. "I knew you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything. It's just to let the air in." The girl did not say anything. "I'll go with you and I'll stay with you all the time. They just let the air in, then it's all perfectly natural." "Then what will we do afterward?" "We'll be fine afterward, just like we were before." "What makes you think so?" "That's the only thing that bothers us. It's the only thing that's made us unhappy." The girl looked at the bead curtain, put her head out and took hold of 2 of the strings of beads. "And then you think we'll be all right and be happy?" "I know we will. You don't have to be afraid. I've known lots of people that have done it." "So have I," said the girl. "And afterward they were all so happy." "Well," the man said, "if you don't want to, you don't have to. I wouldn't have you do it if you didn't want to. But I know it's perfectly simple." "And you really want to?" "I think it's the best thing to do, but I don't want you to do it if you don't really want to." "And if I do it, you'll be happy and things will be like they were and you'll love me?" "I love you now." "You know I love you." "I know. But if I do it, then it will be nice again, and if I say things are like white elephants, you'll like it?" "I'll love it." "I love it now, but I just can't think about it. You know how I get when I worry." "If I do it, you won't ever worry?" "I won't worry about it because it's perfectly simple." "Then I'll do it. Because I don't care about me." "What do you mean?" "I don't care about me." "Well, I care about you." "Oh, yes, but I don't care about me. I'll do it and then everything will be fine." "I don't want you to do it if you feel that way." The girl stood up and walked to the end of the station. Across, on the other side, were fields of grain and trees along the banks of the Ebro. Far away, beyond the river, were mountains. The shadow of a cloud moved across the field of grain, and she saw the river through the trees. "And we could have all this," she said. "And we could have everything, and every day we make it more impossible." "What did you say?" "I said we could have everything." "We can have everything." "No, we can't." "We can have the whole world." "No, we can't." "We can go everywhere." "No, we can't. It isn't ours anymore." "It's ours." "No, it isn't. And once they take it away, you never get it back." "But they haven't taken it away." "We'll wait and see." Come on back in the shade, he said. You mustn't feel that way. I don't feel any way, the girl said. I just know things. I don't want you to do anything that you don't want to do. No, nor that isn't good for me, she said. I know. Could we have another beer? All right, but you've got to realize. I realize, the girl said. Can't we maybe stop talking? They sat down at the table and the girl looked across at the hills on the dry side of the valley, and the man looked at her and at the table. You've got to realize, he said, that I don't want you to do it if you don't want to. I'm perfectly willing to go through with it if it means anything to you. Doesn't it mean anything to you? We could get along. Of course it does, but I don't want anybody but you. I don't want anyone else. And I know it's perfectly simple. Yes, you know it's perfectly simple. It's all right for you to say that, but I do know it. Would you do something for me now? I'd do anything for you. Would you please, 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 please stop talking? He did not say anything, but looked at the bags against the wall of the station. There were labels on them from all the hotels where they had spent nights. But I don't want you to, he said. I don't care anything about it. I'll scream, the girl said. The woman came out through the curtains with 2 glasses of beer and put them down on the damp felt pads. The train comes in 5 minutes, she said. What did she say? Asked the girl. That the train is coming in 5 minutes. The girl smiled brightly at the woman to thank her. I'd better take the bags over to the other side of the station, the man said. She smiled at him. All right, then come back and we'll finish the beer. He picked up the 2 heavy bags and carried them around the station to the other tracks. He looked up the tracks but could not see the train. Coming back, he walked through the bar room where people waiting for the train were drinking. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. He went out through the bead curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. Do you feel better? He asked. I feel fine, she said. The door of Henry's lunchroom opened and 2 men came in. They sat down at the counter. What's yours? George asked them. I don't know, one of the men said. What do you want to eat, Al? I don't know, said Al. I don't know what I want to eat. Outside it was getting dark. The street light came on outside the window. The 2 men at the counter read the menu. From the other end of the counter, Nick Adams watched them. He had been talking to George when they came in. I'll have a roast pork tenderloin with applesauce and mashed potatoes, the first man said. It isn't ready yet. What the hell do you put it on the card for? That's the dinner, George explained. You can get that at 6 o'clock. George looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter. It's 5 o'clock. The clock says 20 minutes past 5, the second man said. It's 20 minutes fast. Oh, now with the clock, the first man said. What have you got to eat? I can give you any kind of sandwiches, George said. You can have ham and eggs, bacon and eggs, liver and bacon, or steak. Give me chicken croquettes with green peas and cream sauce and mashed potatoes. That's the dinner. Everything we want's a dinner, eh? That's the way you work it. I can give you ham and eggs, bacon and eggs, liver. I'll take ham and eggs, the man called Al said. He wore a derby hat and a black overcoat buttoned across the chest. His face was small and white, and he had tight lips. He wore a silk muffler and gloves. Give me bacon and eggs, said the other man. He was about the same size as Al. Their faces were different, but they were dressed like twins. Both wore overcoats too tight for them. They sat leaning forward, their elbows on the counter. Got anything to drink? Al asked. Silver beer, Bevo, ginger ale, George said. I mean, you got anything to drink? Just those I said. This is a hot town, said the other. What do they call it? Summit. Ever hear of it? Al asked his friend. No, said the friend. What do you do here nights? Al asked. They eat the dinner, his friend said. They all come here and eat the big dinner. That's right, George said. So you think that's all right? Al asked George. Sure. You're a pretty bright boy, aren't you? Sure, said George. Well, you're not, said the other little man. Is he, Al? He's dumb, said Al. He turned to Nick. What's your name? Adams. Another bright boy, Al said. Ain't he a bright boy, Max? The town's full of bright boys, Max said. George put the two platters, one of ham and eggs, the other of bacon and eggs, on the counter. He set down 2 side dishes of fried potatoes and closed the wicket into the kitchen. Which is yours? He asked Al. Don't you remember? Ham and eggs. Just a bright boy, Max said. He leaned forward and took the ham and eggs. Both men ate with their gloves on. George watched them eat. What are you looking at? Max looked at George. Nothing. The hell you were. You were looking at me. Maybe the boy meant it for a joke, Max, Al said. George laughed. You don't have to laugh, Max said to him. You don't have to laugh at all. See? All right, said George. So he thinks it's all right. Max turned to Al. He thinks it's all right. That's a good one. Oh, he's a thinker, Al said. They went on eating. What's the bright boy's name down the counter? Al asked Max. Hey, bright boy, Max said to Nick. You go around the other side of the counter with your friend. What's the idea? Nick asked. There isn't any idea. You better go around, bright boy, Al said. Nick went around behind the counter. What's the idea? George asked. None of your damn business, Al said. Who's out in the kitchen? The nigger. What do you mean the nigger? The nigger that cooks. Tell him to come in. What's the idea? Tell him to come in. Where do you think you are? We know damn well where we are, the man called Max said. Do we look silly? You talk silly, Al said to him. What the hell you argue with this kid for? Listen, he said to George. Tell the nigger to come out here. What are you going to do to him? Nothing. Use your head, bright boy. What will you do to a nigger? George opened the slit that opened back into the kitchen. Sam, he called. Come in here a minute. The door of the kitchen opened and the nigger came in. What was it? He asked. The 2 men at the counter took a look at him. All right, nigger. You stand right there, Al said. Sam, the nigger, standing in his apron, looked at the 2 men sitting at the counter. Yes, sir, he said. Al got down from his stool. I'm going back to the kitchen with the nigger and the bright boy, he said. Go on back to the kitchen, nigger. You go with him, bright boy. The little man walked after Nick and Sam, the cook, back into the kitchen. The door shut after them. The man called Max sat at the counter opposite George. He didn't look at George, but looked in the mirror that ran along the back of the counter. Henry's had been made over from a saloon into a lunchroom. Well, bright boy, Max said, looking into the mirror, why don't you say something? What's it called? Well, bright boy, Max said, looking into the mirror, why don't you say something? What's it all about? Hey, Al, Max called. Bright boy wants to know what it's all about. Well, why don't you tell him? Al's voice came from the kitchen. What do you think it's all about? I don't know. What do you think? Max looked into the mirror all the time he was talking. I wouldn't say. Hey, Al, bright boy says he wouldn't say what he thinks it's all about. I can hear you all right, Al said from the kitchen. He had propped open the slit that dishes passed through into the kitchen with a ketchup bottle. Listen, bright boy, he said from the kitchen to George. Stand a little further along the bar. You move a little to the left, Max. He was like a photographer arranging for a group picture. Talk to me, bright boy, Max said. What do you think's going to happen? George did not say anything. I'll tell you, Max said. We're going to kill a Swede. Do you know a big Swede named Ole Anderson? Yes. He comes to eat here every night, don't he? Sometimes he comes here. He comes here at 6 o'clock, don't he? If he comes. We know all that, bright boy. Talk about something else. Ever go to the movies? Once in a while. You ought to go to the movies more. Movies are fine for a bright boy like you. What are you going to kill Laurie Anderson for? What did he ever do to you? He never had a chance to do anything to us. He's never even seen us. And he's only going to see us once, Al said from the kitchen. What are you going to kill him for, then? George asked. We're killing him for a friend. Just to oblige a friend, bright boy. Shut up, said Al from the kitchen. You talk too goddamn much. Well, I got to keep bright boy amused, don't I, bright boy? You talk too damn much, Al said. The nigger and my bright boy are amused by themselves. I got him tied up like a couple of girlfriends in the convent. I suppose you were in a convent? You never know. You were in a kosher convent, that's where you were. George looked up at the clock. If anybody comes in, you tell them the cook is off. If they keep after it, you tell them you'll go back and cook yourself. Do you get that, bright boy? All right, George said. What are you going to do with us afterward? That'll depend, Max said. That's one of those things you never know at the time. George looked up at the clock. It was 6:15. The door from the street opened. A streetcar motorman came in. Hello, George, he said. Can I get supper? Sam's gone out, George said. He'll be back in about half an hour. Well, I better go up the street, the motorman said. George looked at the clock. It was 20 minutes past 6. That was nice, bright boy. You're a regular little gentleman. He knew I'd blow his head off, Al said from the kitchen. No, said Max. It ain't that. Bright boy is nice. He's a nice boy. I like him. At 6:55, George said. He's not coming. 2 other people had been in the lunchroom. Once George had gone out to the kitchen and made a ham and egg sandwich to go that a man wanted to take with him. Inside the kitchen he saw Al, his derby hat ticked back, sitting on a stool beside the wicket with the muzzle of a sawed-off shotgun resting on the edge. Nick and the cook were back to back in the corner, a towel tied in each of their mouths. George had cooked the sandwich, wrapped it up in oiled paper, put it in a bag, brought it in, and the man had paid for it and gone out. A bright boy can do anything, Max said. He can cook and everything. He'd make some girl a nice wife, bright boy. Yes, George said. Your friend, Ole Anderson, isn't going to come. We'll give him 10 minutes, Max said. Max watched the mirror and the clock. The hands of the clock marked 7 o'clock and then 5 minutes past 7. Come on, Al, said Max. We better go. He's not coming. Better give him 5 minutes, Al said from the kitchen. In 5 minutes, a man came in and George explained that the cook was sick. Why the hell don't you get another cook? The man asked. Aren't you running a lunch counter? He went out. Come on, Al, Max said. What about the 2 bright boys and the nigger? They're all right. You think so? Sure. We're through with it. I don't like it, said Al. It's sloppy. You talk too much. Oh, what the hell, said Max. We got to keep amused, don't we? You talk too much all the same, Al said. He came out from the kitchen. The cut-off barrels of the shotgun made a slight bulge under the waist of his too tight-fitting overcoat. He straightened his coat with gloved hands. So long, bright boy, he said to George. You got a lot of luck. That's the truth, Max said. You ought to play the races, bright boy. The 2 of them went out the door. George watched them through the window, pass under the arc light and cross the street. In their tight overcoats and derby hats, they looked like a vaudeville team. George went back through the swinging door into the kitchen and untied Nick and the cook. I don't want any more of that, said Sam, the cook. I don't want any more of that. Nick stood up. He had never had a towel in his mouth before. Say, he said, what the hell? He was trying to swagger it off. They were going to kill Ole Anderson, George said. They were going to shoot him when he came in to eat. Ole Anderson? Sure. The cook felt the corners of his mouth with his thumbs. They all gone? He asked. Yeah, said George. They're gone now. I don't like it, said the cook. I don't like any of it at all. Listen, George said to Nick, you better go see Ole Anderson. All right. You better not have anything to do with it at all, Sam, the cook said. You better stay way out of it. Don't go if you don't want to, George said. Mixing up in this ain't going to get you anywhere, the cook said. You stay out of it. I'll go see him, Nick said to George. Where does he live? The cook turned away. Little boys always know what they want to do, he said. He lives up at Hirsch's rooming house, George said to Nick. I'll go there. Outside, the arc light shone through the bare branches of a tree. Nick walked up the street beside the car tracks and turned at the next arc light down a side street. 3 houses up the street was Hirsch's rooming house. Nick walked up the steps and pushed the bell. A woman came to the door. Is Ole Anderson here? Do you want to see him? Yes, if he's in. Nick followed the woman up a flight of steps and back to the end of a corridor. She knocked on the door. Who is it? It's somebody to see you, Mr. Anderson, the woman said. It's Nick Adams. Come in. Nick opened the door and went into the room. Ole Anderson was lying on the bed with all his clothes on. He had been a heavyweight prize fighter, and he was too long for the bed. He lay with his head on 2 pillows. He did not look at Nick. What was it? He asked. I was up at Henry's, Nick said, and 2 fellows came in and tied me up, and the cook, and they said they were going to kill you. It sounded silly when he said it. Ole Anderson said nothing. They put us out in the kitchen, Nick went on. They were going to shoot you when you came in to supper. Ole Anderson looked at the wall and did not say anything. George thought I'd better come and tell you about it. Well, there isn't anything I can do about it, Ole Anderson said. I'll tell you what they were like. I don't want to know what they were like, Ole Anderson said. He looked at the wall. Thanks for coming to tell me about it. That's all right. Nick looked at the big man lying on the bed. Don't you want me to go and see the police? No, Ole Anderson said. That wouldn't do any good. Isn't there something I could do? No, there ain't nothing to do. Maybe it was just a bluff. No, it ain't just a bluff. Ole Anderson rolled over toward the wall. The only thing is, he said, talking toward the wall, I just can't make up my mind to go out. I've been in here all day. Couldn't you get out of town? No, Ole Anderson said. I'm through with all that running around. He looked at the wall. There ain't anything to do now. Couldn't you fix it up some way? No, I got in wrong. He talked in the same flat voice. There ain't anything to do. After a while, I'll make up my mind to go out. Well, I better go back and see George, Nick said. So long, said Ole Anderson. He did not look toward Nick. Thanks for coming around. Nick went out. As he shut the door, he saw Ole Anderson with all his clothes on, lying on the bed looking at the wall. He's been in his room all day, the landlady said downstairs. I guess he don't feel well. I said to him, Mr. Anderson, you ought to go out and take a walk on a nice fall day like this. But he didn't feel like it. He doesn't want to go out. I'm sorry you don't feel well, the woman said. He's an awfully nice man. He was in the ring, you know. I know it. You'd never know it except from the way his face is, the woman said. They stood talking just inside the street door. He's just as gentle. Well, good night, Mrs. Hirsch, Nick said. Oh, I'm not Mrs. Hirsch, the woman said. She owns the place. I just look after it for her. I'm Mrs. Bell. Well, good night, Mrs. Bell, Nick said. Good night, the woman said. Nick walked up the dark street to the corner under the arc light, and then along the car tracks to Henry's eating house. George was inside, back of the counter. Did you see Ole? Yes, said Nick. He's in his room and he won't go out. The cook opened the door from the kitchen when he heard Dick's voice. I don't even listen to it, he said, and shut the door. Did you tell him about it? George asked. Sure, I told him, but he knows what it's all about. What's he going to do? Nothing. They'll kill him. I guess they will. He must have got mixed up in something in Chicago. I guess so, said Nick. It's a hell of a thing. It's an awful thing, Nick said. They did not say anything. George reached down for a towel and wiped the counter. I wonder what he did, Nick said. Double-cross somebody. That's what they kill him for. I'm going to get out of this town, Nick said. Yes, said George. That's a good thing to do. I can't stand to think about him waiting in the room and knowing he's going to get it. It's too damn awful. Well, said George, you better not think about it.